Okay. So today my guest is Professor Usha Haley. I'll keep an introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Usha as a person, Professor Haley is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Usha Haley is a distinguished chair in international business at Wichita State University. She chairs the World Trade Council of Wichita. Her research focuses on multinational corporations and international strategy, especially in Asian and emerging markets, including business government relations, innovation, technology development, strategic decision-making, sanctions and subsidies. She has over 280 articles, books, and chapters. Two of her books are on international bestseller lists. She has received many competitive research grants, including the NSF. As you know, it's one of the top research institutions, foundations. She sits on 6 academic journals, editorial boards, served as founding co-editor, editor-in-chief, regional editor for 4 journals, edited 4 special issues, and she is the co-editor-in-chief of the book series Multinational Investment and Business and 7-volume Encyclopedia of Multinational Investment and Growth. Thank you, Usha, for joining us.
Thank you, Ilgas, for having me on your program.
You got a great office.
I'm not at my office. I'm at my kitchen table here, having a cup of coffee with a friend, talking about informal things, recorded for posterity and ever, of course. So,
Thank you. Perfect. Let's start. Usha, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Oh, geez. I was born in India. I grew up there, spent my formative years there. And in India, Indians have 2 passions. One is politics and the other is cricket. And I found out early on that I'm not a good cricketer. And I thought I would want to get into politics, but I wasn't really very good at it. And I still am not. And so I became a Monday morning quarterback. I started analyzing what people do in political situations and how resources are distributed. And I'm continuing to do that till today in some format or the other.
Interesting. I mean, I do want to ask you about your influence later on. And that it actually says here that you testified before the US Senate, the Committee on Ways and Means, US International Trade Commission, US Department of Commerce, US Trade of Representatives. And your research on Chinese subsidies is the basis of 3 pieces of EU anti-dumping regulations. How did you, is this because of your background in international relations? How did you get into this side?
See, I consider myself lucky to be an IB person because IB people are more ecumenical in that they look at different things. They look at the same phenomena, but often from different perspectives. So when you can talk to an IB person mostly about political science or economics or management. I mean, they have a very broad, they're interdisciplinary to their bones. It's in their DNA. It's in our DNA. And so that allows you to see problems that are existing. That is, to see an issue again for the first time. And so when I got into this thing of testifying before the US Congress, and as I told you, I've been contacted last week to do so again next month. And I'm also going to be talking about my research at the National Security Forum in May, etc. It started out, as many things have done in my life, fortuitously, by accident. Don't get me wrong, I plan all the time. I plan every detail of the day that I'm in chunks and hours. I have three-month plans, 1-year plans, 5-year plans. And what I have found out is that I'm very good at planning for the small things, what I'm going to wear and what I'm going to have for breakfast. But the big things in life, where I'm going to work, who I'm going to marry, what I'm going to do for decades, my plans haven't worked. And so over time, I've gotten more used to seeing opportunities as they come by and taking them. And we wrote a book, George Haley, my husband, Tan Chin Tiong, who's a prominent professor in Singapore, and I, when we were in Singapore, called the Chinese, we wrote 2 books, New Asian Emperors, and another one called The Chinese Tao of Business. But both made bestseller lists. I mean, they were not written for an academic audience. And this book, New Asian Emperors, and that we wrote, that the data that we use and that we teach our students, the theories based on these data that we teach to our students in classes are not what managers and policymakers use in emerging markets. And at that time, it was revolutionary because even our government relies on data. The US government relies on data that these emerging markets communicate to them. So they rely on official data. But if you talk to any of these policymakers and managers about the data that they use, they say they don't use these data. They often have these data for legitimacy purposes for certain stakeholders, but they use different kinds of data because they know, as we found out, that many times these data are not worth the paper on which they're written. So I got a call, and this was, almost more than a decade ago. And the person in government with whom I still communicate said, I read your book, New Asian Emperors. It was written up in the Economist and the Wall Street Journal. And I want to ask you, we're doing this, we have this issue with Chinese subsidies. We know they're subsidizing, but the data that they are releasing don't seem to make any sense with what we're seeing. Can you do it? Can you help with that? And I said, yeah, sure, I think I can. I've got to start off and look at all the data and things. And we did. We started off, and what I thought would be a 3-month project went on for a year. And that was the steel subsidies. To date, it remains the only systematic study of how China subsidizes its steel industry. Well, those data, and I want to say right off here, when people say, oh, you're testifying before the US Congress, but I write for journal articles. Let me tell them that testifying before the US Congress, when it deals with billions of dollars of trade and other, is far more stressful because each interested party gets their own lawyers, gets their own investigators to go through the data with a fine-tooth comb. They have much more at stake than a journal article. And so they did that, and the data stood up to scrutiny. So these data and others like that were made into regulation. And I don't know very many other people. I mean, I know a few, but I don't know very many other people who can say that their work has been incorporated directly into over 40 pieces of, has had regulatory influence over 40 times and has actually been incorporated into federal regulation, the basis for federal regulation in the US as well as the EU and Germany, and discussed in Parliament in Australia and India. So
this is fascinating. Usha, I'm curious. I mean, you were born in India. Then between that part of your life and the story just you just explained, you're not only an academic, but also you have influence on policy. And these institutions, these supranational, let's call them supranationals. So how did you choose academia in the first place?
Because I wasn't really very good at anything else. No, I'm sorry. Let me just back up here. I told you I was not a good politician. But my family, they pushed education. A lot of Indian families do. So my father did his PhD in Tübingen in West Germany, and he had 2 Nobel laureates on his PhD committee. And he thought he was a chemical engineer, as most good Indians are. They're engineers or medical doctors. So when I decided that I wanted to be a political scientist, which I got my first bachelor's in politics from Elphinstone College in Bombay, and that I wanted to continue. I mean, it really did break his heart because he wanted me to be an engineer like him or a doctor like all my cousins were. So I first started out in the master's and PhD program at, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, I hope when I was going through my bachelor's, I was still very young, and I applied to the GRE, and I believe I topped the GRE worldwide. So in those days in India, we could not get money out. I mean, my father could not for example, pay for my education in the US. I had to get scholarships. And so at first, when I sent out my transcripts and all that, they weren't really impressed. A first class in India means a lot. And a 90 plus in the US means just an A. So it's, they weren't impressed. But then when they saw the GRE scores, I still remember my old professor, Raja Kanat, says, "Oh, these other scores, they don't make that much sense to us. We don't know what they actually mean, what her background is. But this score translates. And these scores, we should give her a chance." You've got to understand, I was only 17 when I came to the US. I thought I was old, but I wasn't really in retrospect. I got my first master's at the University of Illinois at Urbana when I was 18. And I was in the PhD program because that's the way it drifted on. I wasn't really interested and I wasn't really ready. So I pulled out and I was a speechwriter for the UN for a while. And by that time, I was like, say, 18 or 19. I did graduate work in journalism, mass communications research, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I worked as a journalist and I was still young. I think I was 21 or so. And by that time, I had come to realize that I really did want to do a PhD after all. I enjoyed delving into problems. I enjoyed the university atmosphere. And so I applied. I wanted to do a PhD in international business. My father became a businessman in India. I grew up with business people, and I was always international. I mean, that's growing up in India at the time that I was. We were international. Certain, upper middle class people were international. I wanted to do that, and my studies had all been international relations, etc. So I got into the PhD program at NYU, and that for all practical purposes was a double PhD program. So you actually got everything, all the coursework, etc., for a PhD in your functional area, which for me was management. But then you got a real grounding in economics and statistics and all the other things that we use as scholars in IB. And that was a wonderful experience. It took me 7 years, though, and I was trained to be an academic in both areas. And then I couldn't get a job. I graduated during the Reagan era, and I tried and tried, and I couldn't. So I turned to my husband and said, what do you think I should do? I had gotten an offer to be a consultant at a major company in Italy. I took that job for like a year. I was working as a consultant in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Florence. But I really did want to get back into academics. And at that time, my husband said, "Look, why don't we become emerging market specialists?" And I've got to know, in those days, emerging markets weren't in the forefront as they are now. I remember my journalism professor saying, first, lead on the first page of the newspaper, "Man bites dog." Page 4 or 5, Russia bombs China. But honestly, that failure, the failure of not being able to get a job, which in those days I thought was crushing, led to the most amazing opportunities because I saw the rest of the world. And I do believe that even though I was born elsewhere and grew up elsewhere and came to this country only when I was 17, that you really do need training in a country. It's not just sufficient that you're born in another country. You need training in international business. You need the training to understand at an academic level a different culture or a different society and their institutions. I got that. So when I went to these emerging markets, I wasn't just going as somebody who was born in India and knew my little part of India really well. I was going there as a trained academic. And it was the most marvelous experience. We had not been married very long. We still didn't have a child. So we first went to Mexico and we worked at the Tecnológico de Monterrey. It's a fabulous experience. And then we already had other jobs. We had a job at the National University of Singapore. I wanted to stay in Mexico another year, and I kept postponing And they wrote me back, and knowing Singapore, it wasn't an idle threat. If you don't come, you will never step into Singapore again. We're not postponing by another year. So we went to Singapore. And every single time when you get uprooted and you start working in a new country, in a new academic environment, where your old networks, your old data don't seem to make very much sense, you are forced to form new roots. It's like a tree being uprooted. You're forced to see things again for the first time. And that itself was an extraordinary experience, being an academic. NUS gave us the opportunity to get to know Southeast Asia and develop an interest in China. And then I've continued to work abroad in universities. I worked in Australia. I worked in New Zealand most recently. And I've been an academic. And I think, I hope I have been more than a Monday morning quarterback.
Fascinating. Something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting about you.
Oh, I love cooking.
Yeah.
I collect cookbooks. There's something about cooking, it's constrained. You have to work within the kitchen environment and your implements, but it's also creative. You can't just sit there, stir and let your mind wander off. It's just the right mixture of being involved and of letting go. And I find that I'm not the greatest cook in the world. I mean, I've just finished a study of Michelin star chefs and their creativity. And we had the opportunity to study these top quality chefs and their innovation. And clearly there is no comparison. But for me, I'm always trying, it's just the right mixture of challenge and understanding and continuity.
About regret, something that you wish you would have done or done differently?
Oh my gosh, these are tough questions. I don't really know. I mean, you can't step into the same river twice. So if I had taken another path, I don't know in which reality I would be in. I know I didn't take the path I planned. But would I have actually changed what I learned, the experiences I had, the people I met? I don't know. I mean, I think that would be too far across. I don't really know. I didn't take a job at a top university in the US, and my path would have been different. And I made some other decisions, but it's like the branching of a tree, you don't really know what would have been.
Sure. Usha, what are you most proud of?
I think the external influence that I have had, this sort of stuff, the getting into Congress and the testimonies and the effects on regulation, the fact that I've taken risks with my career, even when they were not easy risks, when they were not the easy thing to do. I did that. And so I paid the price. I have the scars. But when I sit back and I think of myself as a young girl, I don't think I ever wanted to say, and I never thought about it quite that way, Usha, when you grow up, you want to be somebody who publishes just these articles that appeal to 2 or 3 people in your field, and nobody else knows anything about it. I wanted to make a difference, like so many young people do, and I have tried to do that.
Thank you. About the research portion, how do you explain your research and what you do? Why is it important to people on the street, laymen who don't read academic research, who don't come to our conferences?
That's actually a tough question. I'm a problem solver, and I see myself as a creative problem solver. But if you look at my work, almost all of it is international. I can think of one article among the hundreds I've published or the books that is not international. So that is my perspective. I look at international problems. Within those, I go into depth, and I'm often influenced by what I know. If you look at the clusters, for example, let me just talk about the subsidy stuff we talked about, the sanction stuff that I'm still dealing with. And I told you about the work with the government and the national security, issues that I'm dealing with. But the work that I did the work I'm doing currently on creativity and innovation And one of the things I did learn as an academic that I didn't know as a layperson was that the level of analysis is everything. So for example, when I look at the creativity and innovation of chefs, it's quite different from the NSF grant that I'm doing and the book I'm writing for Oxford University Press on it, which is creativity and innovation in an industry and how foreign direct investment shapes that innovation trajectory. You look at very many different variables, but the issues have been somewhat the same. So creativity and innovation, technology management, sanctions, subsidies, foreign direct investment, multinationals, and trade. Oh, I've started doing a lot of work now on impact, external impact. And that too was a sort of a fortuitous meandering.
Okay. About creativity in, how do you approach creativity in scholarship? Or what do you think of creativity in scholarship? Not creative innovation in industry, but creativity in academic work.
One of the things that the chefs have taught me is that you don't have to be wildly creative. So for example, there are chefs that deal with the traditional French classique cuisine. And there you have a very, very strict rules within that cuisine. And yet you can be creative. And then there are chefs that deal with nouvelle cuisine and avant-garde cuisine. And you can be wildly creative and use blowtorches, on flans. And they too are creative. So I really think it depends on the constraints and the value that you want to contribute at your level of analysis. And you don't have to break down every barrier, change the way we look at the world forever, with one phrase. You can be creative within constraints. And I do think there are plenty of people in IB, not pessimistic. I do think there are plenty of people in IB who are creative within the limits that they have set for themselves.
About IB curiosity. Now let's just put your thinking in this term, in the term of how the French chefs are creating interesting things to eat. Right? How is the process working for them? Do they just sit idly and all of a sudden something comes to their mind?
Sometimes it does. But those that are working in classique cuisine, where there are really strict regulations, they are more bound by the rules. Even within those rules, they strive for perfection and creativity. And Michelin stars, we chose that because we spoke to these chefs at length and observed them. And one of my co-authors on this project happened to train as a Michelin star chef. So he also brought in a different perspective. But the stars mark you on creativity. So creativity is others see you, not just as how you see yourself. So these classique cuisine, the French classique cuisine, they are much more constrained by the rules of that cuisine, but they are creative nevertheless. But when you talk about avant-garde, where you inhale your food and other such things, they are less constrained and they too are creative. But even then, they find some rhythm within that creativity. So I'm not really talking about first come, first serve creativity, new to an idea. I don't believe there are very many new ideas per se, but I do think that you have to build up systematically on knowledge for breakthroughs. And it could be at a different trajectory for anyone, but it doesn't have to be wildly creative new ideas. You could be creative within the constraints you've set for yourself.
About
I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. It was very helpful. About research in IB, what are the next big questions that we should be asking? What are some of the things that we've forgotten or neglected or omitted?
I think what drew me to IB and what keeps me there is that we are a place of big ideas. And our ideas literally change the world. I mean, we don't really have to sit and hide, our talent of what we have done. Our theories of the multinational corporation is Stephenheimer's conceptualization of why a multinational corporation is different from a domestic corporation. Our theories of international trade, such as comparative advantage, have literally shaped the way we work and see the distribution of power. The power of nation states vis-a-vis multinationals, the power of trading partners over each other. And so I do think we need to go back to those big ideas. So, for example, there are push and pull in academics, and there is this huge pull to be doing incremental work because we need to, at a certain stage of career, young scholars do need to publish or they perish. And so there's an enormous incentive to publish in certain sorts of journals. And don't get me wrong, I'm very proud of my Gibbs article, so I do understand the value of those sorts of things. But I do think that perhaps they may want to keep a notebook because they're going to get more and more focused and become, concentrating on 2 or 3 variables and the methodology of it all. But to keep a notebook of the big ideas that inspired them, of the changes that they hoped to create, and go back and refer to them, sort of like a journal every once in a while, to keep them inspired. See, the work I'm doing currently on impact, and I'm looking at it as a management scholar, but in the last few months, I've been working with the editor from FT, Financial Times, and also with Sage on looking at academic impact. Most of us start off wanting to have external impact. By the time we get through the career phase, we've established ourselves. Either the drive has decreased or we've lost the vocabulary to communicate to external stakeholders. I think we need a drive. There is a work, I think it's really more of a back of the envelope calculation done at Wharton that I quote in my latest book, Impact in the Management Researcher, that it costs society about $400,000 to publish what we would consider an A+ journal article. Gibbs would be among them. Think of the cost to society if nobody really benefits from those ideas and that work, except 2 or 3 people in our very narrow fields or expertise. So we really do need to think of ourselves as being part of ecosystems, as of providing public service, really, of communicating our ideas, our brilliance. I mean, there are brilliant scholars in international business, as there are in every other part of academics, to a wider audience. And it's not just lowering ourselves to talk to people. It's actually communicating in a vocabulary that's meaningful for them.
What can you say about the evolution of the field and what are we losing along the way? Where are we headed to, basically?
Okay, I see several trajectories that could take place. I do fear that this pendulum might swing too far to become methodologists. And as my friend Kerry Cooper said, he does not see impact as standing on one leg doing Lisra. Okay, that's not impact. Impact is actually reaching out and influencing. And you could have influence on students, of course, and through them through society. But with every step, there is a filter. So if you influence students, their views will impact the world as much as your views will. That's important as well. But actually influencing government, as we did as IB scholars, influencing the way companies.
Early on, you mean?
Not so much now, given the numbers. Okay, I'm sure there are people who are doing it now as well, but the proportion has decreased. Wouldn't you say? Would you agree?
So you're saying early on, so you're talking about 1970s, 1980s,
yes.
IB was more impactful. Is that what you're saying?
Externally impactful.
External impact. And
I'm just talking about the proportion of people working in the area. I'm sure there are people who are working now in the area. But if we whip out impact figures from journals and other things as being impactful, or even citations, it's not enough. We do need to have some external impact, simply because we live in ecosystems.
Ecosystems of?
Well, ecosystems that include governments and companies and societies and communities. all of whom support our work.
What's your prediction? I asked this question to quite a number of people. Is it going to be the world of globalization going forward? Is it going to be the world of nationalization and more populism? Studies on that impact that we will observe in the media, in not really academic, but actual policy outlets. What is the next step?
I don't think it's going to be as clear-cut as all that. I think as in most areas, it's going to be a gray. There are some areas where we will be global. But I do think we've understood through this pandemic, certainly, that supply chains are affected when they're completely global. We do need to start thinking about risk aversion. We need to start giving back to building up the communities in which we are based, and not just think about building up every other country in the world. So that too is important. I mean, and I do think we're going to get some sort of fragmentation. I don't know how things are going to eventually fall into place. I try is never to make predictions, especially about the future. I find I'm making them all the time and they keep getting replayed because they're wrong. So that's how I feel. I think there will be some areas that will be global. I do think there are some areas that will be regional, even local. And I think that will continue to change as we have new technologies, new problems that come up. We will come up with new solutions.
Perfect. Usha, do you remember the best advice you received when you were going through the PhD program yourself?
I can't think of one piece of advice. I don't think I would have followed it. I think it was more the behavior of the people that I grew to admire. Their consistency, their discipline, their humility, their desire to have an impact, not just to the students, but out to the outside world. I think those consistent behaviors were to me, and just basically their decency. We tend to forget as academics that we're also people, just basic decency towards academics and towards students and others. And I think that their behavior, more than their one piece of advice, really had a great influence.
Okay. Can you identify a couple of top 3 big mistakes that people often do, young scholars, junior faculty, PhD students usually? Can you pinpoint some of the major problems or issues that you see that you would say, don't do it? There is a better way of doing it so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
Oh, mistakes. I don't want to start breaking into Frank Sinatra's song. I've made too many mistakes. Really, I hope I have learned from them. Every single time I have tried to regroup and change my trajectory. I do think some of the mistakes I made led to some of the best outcomes that I could have hoped for that I never planned for. I do think I can't advise people generally on the kinds of mistakes to avoid. I do think, as perhaps what I learned as an IB academic and going through the IB PhD programs, was that we instinctively in IB know that we can't theories don't literally translate across the world. So say a theory developed in the United States cannot be expected to be applied willy-nilly to India or Japan or the Seychelles or something to that. But we should also understand that data similarly cannot be translated. So the data that we create that shapes our theories and our testing of theories are not the same around the world, nor are the institutions that produce these data the same. And I think that is something we still don't instinctively understand. So distributing surveys in China will not get you the same degree of validity as it would in the US because of the constraints. I'm just using one example. For me, finding out that the data that these governments release, not necessarily for nefarious purposes, but because the institutions were not really capable of generating the granular, valid data that we have in the US, could not really be relied on by our policymakers to form decisions about China or anywhere else. So that I think we still need to understand instinctively. We do understand theory can't go around, and a lot of disciplines don't.
True. For the sake of time, what's a question that I should have asked you but haven't?
Oh, wow. These are tough questions. You didn't tell me you were going to be such a tough interviewer. I think, why do you do what you do?
There you go.
Why do I do? Because I enjoy it. I get up in the morning excited about working. I delve into problems. I'm inspired by so many people. I get ideas from so many sources. And when it stops being fun, I hope I have the courage to leave.
Perfect. This was very interesting. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you so much, Usha.
Thank you.